In the last video, we talked all about hoisting, which is a fairly simple topic. So now we're going to move on to a bit of a more complex topic, which is the idea of scope. So let's just create a couple functions so we have something to work with. We'll have a function that's called say hi, takes in a name, and we're going to actually create a variable in this function called result is equal to hi, and then we're just going to put the name on there. Let's just capitalize this H, make it look a little nicer. And then we're just going to console.log out our result. So if we call this function, we could say hi, and we could pass it a name like Kyle, click save, and it's going to print out hi Kyle. Okay, that makes sense. Now let's take this even a step further and let's create our variable name, and we're going to set that equal to Kyle. So we'll say Kyle here, and we'll pass that name to the function. Everything should still work the same as before. There we go, just like I expect. Now this may seem a little bit confusing though, because remember when I said you can't have two variables with the same name? But you'll notice here we have a variable called name here, and then inside this function we have another variable called name, and these are actually two separate variables. We can see this even a little bit more if I were to name this result instead, and then pass in result. Now we have two variables very clearly named result, but when I save, everything works just the same as before. So why exactly is that? And the reason is scoping. So the way that scope works is that every single time essentially that you have a set of curly braces like this, so essentially inside of a function, inside of an arrow function would be another one. So if you have an arrow function that looks like this and you have curly braces, everything inside of here is its own scope. Essentially, anytime you have curly braces, you are working inside of a particular scope, and every function has its own scope. So we have our scope that is called the global scope. This is everything inside of your program. This entire file is our global scope. And then within that global scope, we have smaller scopes. So for example, we have the scope for this single say hi function, which contains this variable here and this log statement, while our global scope contains all of this. And we can even see this by if we were to, for example, just throw an error into our code here, just random text is going to give us an error, and we save. Let me just expand this a little bit. You're going to see here that we have our error, and it's telling us we have an error. And then over on the right-hand side here, we have this section called scope. And you'll see we have a global scope here, which has essentially everything available to JavaScript. So our console is in here for like console.log and stuff like that. And then we have our script scope, which is essentially the scope that we are currently in for our script file. And you'll notice it has Kyle as the result variable. So we can see that that variable result has the value of Kyle inside of the global scope here of our entire file. But you'll also notice we don't have our result variable for our say hi function. And the reason for that is that we're in an outer scope. Essentially, we see everything inside this function that's the outer scope, but outer scopes can never see into subscopes. So this function is defined inside this whole outer scope. We don't have access to the scope of this function from the outer scope. Imagine it like a bunch of one-way doors. When you're on the inside of all the one-way doors, you can walk out as far as you want. But when you're on the outside of a one-way door, you cannot walk in. So you can't see what's past that door. And these functions act as one-way doors. You can never see into them from outside, but when you're inside them, you can see outside. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Let's take our variable, our error here, and just move that inside of our say hi function. Let's just make sure we click this resume button, save our file again, and it'll rerun. And you're going to notice something interesting now. Here over on our scope section, I'm just going to expand this even a little bit more. We have now here a local scope. We have a script scope and we have a global scope. So local scope refers to the scope that we're currently in. That's this say hi function. We're locally inside of this inner scope. And you can see we have name being equal to Kyle, which is this name variable up here passed into the function. We have a result being set to hi Kyle, which is this result variable here. And then if we open up our script, you can see we have result here, which is set to Kyle. So we can see outside the function because it's a one-way door. Like I said, we can see outside the function, but we can never see into it. So now we have two sets of scope. We have this scope here, and we have this outer scope here. And the inner scope and outer scope can have variables that are exactly the same name, and they're not going to conflict because they're in different scopes from one another. Let's take that even a little bit further, and let's create a variable here, just a new one. We're going to say let a equal 1, and click the continue button, resave our file so we get our error showing up. And you're going to notice here the same thing. We have a equal 1 in this outer scope here, name, result, all of the rest of that is exactly the same. But you'll notice something interesting. I can actually use a inside of this function, even though I don't pass it to the function. So let's just add on a to the end of this. So now we have result is equal to hi plus name plus a. And we'll get rid of this result here. We're just going to instead pass Kyle directly into here to get rid of any confusion. So click the play button, let it all finish out, resave. So we have that error showing up. Let me just grow this in size. And now you'll see here, we have A as our script level scope, and in our local scope, our name is Kyle, and the result is hi Kyle with that variable A of 1 being appended to the end of it. So what essentially happened is what we did is we looked inside this scope. We saw this variable A here, right? And we looked inside of our current scope and we said, do we have any variables named A? Nope, there's no variables named A. So then we said, okay, move up to the next scope, which is this whole file. Do we have any files named A here? And yep, we have one variable named A here. The value is 1, so it used that value here. And it always starts from the inside and goes outward. So if I expand this back over, and I were to come in here and instead create A equal to 2. So now we have A equals 1 out here and A equals 2 in here. If I just click play, resave, you'll see something interesting. Our result is now hi Kyle 2 instead of hi Kyle 1. And that's because, like I said, it checks in your local scope first to see if you have any variable with that name. In our case, A right here is equal to 2 inside this scope, so it uses this value instead of using the value inside the global scope. And again, to further emphasize the point that we can't access things from an outer scope that are in an inner scope, let's just say here that we wanted to do console.log result. So here, result is being set inside of our say function, and we want to log it out down here. Let's just get rid of this error. So everything should work. Let's click play over here, click the save button, and you'll notice we actually get an error. It says result is not defined. And that's because result is defined in this inner scope here, this smaller scope, and we don't have access to that smaller scope from this outer scope. To emphasize this a little bit more, let's just come back here. We're going to delete all the code that we have. And like I mentioned at the beginning, when you have sets of curly braces, that essentially is defining a new scope. So we can define a new scope just by putting curly braces and then writing code inside these curly braces. So here we have a scope, and we can come down here and create another scope inside these curly braces. This is not something you'll really ever see in actual JavaScript code, but it's great for demonstrating how scopes work. So in here, let's just say let A equal 1, and in here we'll say let A equal 2. And then outside of both of these, we'll say let A equal 3. And what we do is we'll just do a log in all of these. So we'll say console.log A. We're going to do that in all 3 of these different scopes. Let's just make sure we have it down here. There we go. And if we click save, make sure we click the play button over here. When we come over to our console, you can see we get printed out 1, 2, 3. Because inside this scope, A is 1. Inside this scope, A is 2. And inside this scope, A is 3. And again, if we remove A from here, and now we run this, we're going to get an error because A is not defined inside this outer scope. It's only defined in these inner scopes, which technically these don't really exist when you're in the outer scope. You can only access things in the outer scope. And as you can see in the outer scope, there is no A variable being defined. On top of that, you can even nest scopes inside of other scopes. So we could create a scope inside of this scope where we then define, let's say B equals 2. We do console.log A, and we're going to do a console.log B. And let's just get rid of all of this other code that we don't need. So all we have is A being defined here in this outer scope. And then we have B being defined in this middle inner scope. And let's even go so far as to create a variable C. And we'll set that to 3. That's going to be in the far outside. And we can log all 3 of these and just click the play button over here and save. We go to our console, you can see it prints out 1, 2, 3 for A, B, and C. And that's because we're in the most inner scope. So we have access to things inside our current scope, inside the scope outside that, and then outside the scope in that. So as long as you're inside a scope, you can see everything outside of you, but you can never see anything farther in. So at this A point, we cannot see B. If I move this log B up into here, click save, we're going to get an error because B is defined only in the inner scope and not in this outer scope. Now that's a lot of talk about scoping, and I kind of repeated a lot that really you just have to worry about whether you're the inner scope or the outer scope, and that'll determine everything for you. In the next video, we're going to talk about closures, so I can't wait to see you in that video.